Hello everyone, nice to meet you. My name is Martina Steidroda, you can call me Astrid. I use they, them pronouns, and I am a third-year DPhil student at Jesus College, Oxford. I'm Italian, this is my fourth year in the UK, so 3 years of my PhD, and I was in Durham for a year before coming to Oxford. And as I mentioned, I'm a third-year DPhil student in classical languages and literature, which you may more commonly know as classics, which means that my faculty sort of covers everything that has to do with ancient Greece and Rome. There is specifically a sub-faculty of ancient history, which I'm not directly involved with, and classical languages and literature deals with anything that has to do with the writings and the linguistic reality of the ancient world, Greece and Rome specifically. What I do is mostly focused on ancient Greek and mostly focused on language rather than literature. The official title of my project is A Corpus Study of Linguistic Variation in the Formulaic Language of Early Greek Epic. A, it's a mouthful. B, it's super complicated. So we're going to break it down bit by bit. Let's start from the end. Early Greek Epic. By Early Greek Epic, I mean a body of texts that is mostly made of the two big poems by Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, the two smaller but still excellent poems by Hesiod, the Theogony and the Works and Days, and then a small group of Homeric hymns, which are short texts that address deities and that are attributed to Homer, but everyone since antiquity knew that they weren't really by Homer. These texts have a huge array of themes. So the Iliad and the Odyssey, you will probably know, deal with the war at Troy, that's the Iliad, and then the return of Odysseus to his native land of Ithaca, and that's the Odyssey. So, you know, heroic exploits, war, voyages, monsters. The Theogony is a story of how the Greek gods came to be and came to power. Theogony means the birth, the genealogy of the gods. The Works and Days is a poem in which Hesiod, a poet who is really, really angry at his stepbrother for stealing his inheritance, basically explains to his stepbrother why it's really important to be a good person and how exactly you can be a good person within the parameters of archaic Greek society. And then the Homeric hymns, as I've said, are like praise poems addressed to deities. So, very wide array of themes. What makes all these poems, what makes them be a coherent body of literature? Well, two things. One of them is their meter. They're all written in a kind of meter that's called hexameter, and it goes dun da da 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 dun da. That's more or less what it sounds like. There is some variation. It's not exactly that boring all the time, but each line sounds more or less like this. So all of these poems are written in this meter. It's always the same form of line, all the way down to 14,000 lines of the Iliad. So that's one thing they have in common. The other thing they have in common is that this is a body of orally performed poetry. Not just orally performed, but orally composed. So you have to imagine a singer, a professionally trained bard, stepping up in front of an audience and starting to sing about, for instance, you know, the heroic exploits of Achilles that one day in Troy. He sings in this dun da dun da dun etc. meter. The problem is, improvising in front of an audience is kind of really difficult, which is something I'm really feeling right now, incidentally. So the easiest way to make improvising for a very lengthy amount of time on very difficult themes a little bit easier for the performer is to have a set of linguistic tools that help you do that. Early Greek epic copes with this by creating an artistic language. The fancy term for this is Kunstsprache, which in German just means artistic language. So this artistic language is made of what we call formulae. A formula is just a set phrase that is always used to express the same essential idea. And you may be familiar with formulae sort of in the form of noun epithet phrases. So things like swift-footed Achilles for Achilles, very wily Odysseus for Odysseus, the more important the hero, the the more and better epithets they have. Or, there are also noun epithet phrases for common things that are mentioned a lot. So you almost never find just the word for ship alone in the Iliad or the Odyssey, and there are a lot of ships, trust me. What you find is something like swift ships or black ships, and so on. So these are the most basic kind of formulae, and then there are entire set phrases that are used in specific contexts when something is happening. So for instance, when someone stands up and starts to speak, you will have a formula that means, and they stood up and started to speak, or and in the assembly they started to speak. Depending on the context, there is a set of them. This, from a cognitive point of view, this makes the burden on the singer significantly smaller, because they don't have to think, oh no, I need to come up with a phrase for this person who's standing up and starting to speak, because they already have one, which they have more or less memorized. The problem, what my default looks at, is exactly this question of they had it more or less memorized. Because one thing with phrases that we have memorized, and we all have them, we all have, those tiny quirks of language that we always use, or for a non-native speaker like me, when you learn a second language, it's really useful to memorize phrases. The problem is you can't always use the same phrase in the same way. You need to change it to adapt it to the context that you're using it in. Which is what happens in early Greek epic a lot of the time. So what my default focuses on is trying to see what kinds of variation there are in this kind of formulaic language made of stock phrases, and how do we actually measure this variation? How do we quantify it? Because it's really easy to say, this is happening, this happens sometimes, this happens more than once. But what is really interesting is figuring out what things happen more or less frequently, and also how the frequency with which some kinds of variation happen correlate with other phenomena that are going on in the language. So my default looks at two things specifically: syntactic variation, so variation in shape, and semantic variation, so variation in meaning. For the half of my work that deals with variation in shape, which is the half that I have finished, happily, it's done, I'm looking at noun plus adjective formulae, so things like swift ship. And I'm looking at in what form they appear. Do they appear, ancient Greek has cases, so in what cases do they appear, in what number do they appear, but also do they appear with another adjective? Is it maybe swift and powerful ships? Something like that. And then what I'm looking at is how often do all of these kinds of variation happen in a non-formulaic corpus? How often do normal noun plus adjective pairs appear in different cases? What is their overall rate of variation? And the results of this show us that actually the more frequently a formula happens, the more often it is changed, which seems kind of natural. The more frequently you use a phrase, then, the more often you will be forced to adapt it to your context because you have more context. That's true, but it also tells us one thing, that even the most frequent phrases are not memorized as like pre-made, unchangeable building blocks. They will change, they need to change, because that's how language works when you're trying to use it productively. The second side of my default, which I'm still working on, is the one on meaning. And what I am actually looking at, is the direct object complements of transitive verbs. So things like, I pick up a spear, which happens a lot in Greek epic. What kind of things can you pick up? And are there any restrictions in the meaning of the things that you can do things to? There are a lot of things in this sentence. The general idea is that even though syntactic variation, so variation in form, will be very frequent because you need to adapt the language you're using to the context in which you're using it, variation in meaning will be less frequent because the kinds of things that you use formulaic phrases for are restricted. And this maps very well with current accounts of how we use language. We memorize things that have a specific meaning, and then we also change them and adapt them to fit the linguistic context in which we're using them. Two final things that I want to say about my project. One is that all of my project relies on digitized corpora, so databases of text in ancient Greek, which are pre-processed, and there is a lot of work being done on this by researchers in ancient Greek computational linguistics, and this work often goes unrecognized because, if the entire outcome of your research project is I have produced a database, that doesn't always look terribly good, especially in classics. But this work is absolutely essential to enable the sort of research that I do and that many other people do. The second thing that I want to do is, since this is a video about Jesus College, Jesus has enabled me to do two things that I really care about. One is to do a lot of teaching, because thankfully there is a very small but very keen group of undergraduates in classics who do excellent work, and I'm really proud to be teaching them. But the most important thing is I would not be doing this research if it weren't for Jesus College Graduate Scholarship in the Humanities, which is entirely funding my PhD. So thank you very much for this. Thank you for bearing with me while I talked about my research for 11 minutes. That's a lot. And if you're ever in Oxford, I hope to see you around. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay happy as much as you can. Bye.